Good morning, everyone. And on behalf of the Global Labor Research Center and the Department of Politics at York University, it is a pleasure to welcome all of you to today's event, which is the last of a 5-part series that is organized on the subject of social justice movements. We also want to acknowledge the very generous support that the York University Staff Association extended to this series. And of course, to John Clarke, who is the Parker Visitor on Social Justice at York University, for his key role in organizing the series. Recordings of this event and previous events are going to be available in the Global Labor Research Center website. Just to start our conversation today, I will start with the land acknowledgement. And because this meeting is virtual and because of what we all and we are not all gathered in the same space. York's land acknowledgements might not represent the territory that you are currently on. And I would like to ask, if that is the case, that you each take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory that you are on and its current treaty holders. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tacoronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. It is now home to many Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon, One Pound Bell Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Let us hope that we all keep this in our heart. Complete this acknowledgement, I would like now to introduce our Associate Dean in the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies for Faculty Affairs, Debbie Mortimer, who is going to talk briefly about a very dear colleague of ours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I did want to bring, first of all, the greetings of the Dean, J.J. McMurtry. Like so many of us, he's had a long association with Leo Panich, and whom this series is dedicated, and is sorry he can't join us this morning. I also wanted to extend my thanks and his to John, the Packer Visitor, to the GLRC, and of course to the Department of Politics, near and dear to my heart, for organizing this series in Leo's honor. I've just been asked to say a few words off the top about Leo Panich, which, as any of you who have tried to do this in the past few months will know, is really a very daunting task. There's already been much said about Leo's tremendous contribution to scholarship and his contribution to the struggle for social justice. And of course, there's much more that needs to be said and will be said. But there are others, and in fact, others here who are better placed than I am to say those things. Instead, I just wanted to take a moment to reflect on Leo's intellectual and collegial generosity, and to do so from a rather personal vantage, if I may. Because I first met Leo when I took a PhD course with him, and it was one that was filled with a bunch of whip-smart people already well-versed in the various Marxist traditions, which I have to confess, coming from Western, I was not. And as I began an exploration of the ideas that underpin so much of his work, and which many of the others in the room took for granted, if not as gospel, Leo created for me a welcoming space for often uncomprehending and indeed, frankly, skeptical inquiry. I learned a lot, but I never fully joined him where he was. And what I found remarkable, that was just fine with him. He wasn't seeking acolytes. he was seeking exploration. Similarly, some years later, and I will not say how many, I became chair of the Department of Politics. And it's a role that many in the department felt really was Leo's, whoever happened to be playing it at the time. It wasn't the only reason that he was known as Chairman Leo, but it really was one of them. However, despite not agreeing with everything that I was trying to do, he was again generous in both his private and his public support of my efforts. In fact, as any of you who have had the pleasure of being a guest in Leo's home will know, this professional generosity grew from a generosity of spirit that was in evidence in all of Leo's life. And it might not have the global significance of his scholarly or his political activities. That generosity meant the world to those of us fortunate enough to have known him. It certainly contributed to the building of an excellent Department of Politics. And I cannot help but believe that it informed that lifelong commitment in his scholarship and in his activism to seeking social justice. Thank you again for the opportunity to join you this morning, for saying a word or two about our friend and colleague, Leo Panich. And I really look forward to the discussion we will have.
Thank you, David, so much for the words. I think that we are still trying to really get used to the idea of the world without Leo. Thank you very much for that. Thank you. So my next task is to cover with you some technical details. I might not be the best person to do that, but I try my very best. So we will use the question and answer function, which can be found in the bottom of your screen. So the chat would not be would be closed. Any questions and comments can be sent to using that function. There is also closed captions available, and that's also available in the. It's also available in the bottom of your panel. And so I think that if there is any question about this, I think that we are now ready to start. And to start, I also had a very nice job of introducing Dr. AJ Withers, who is going to be the moderator of the discussion today. AJ is a long-time anti-poverty organizer in Toronto. They are the co-author of A Violent History of Benevolence, Interlocking Oppression in the Moral Economies of Social Working, with Chris Chapman, and that was published by the U of T Press in 2019. And they are also author of Disability Politics and Theory, published by Fernbook in 2012, and stillmyrevolution.org, which is something I'm going to check right away. So AJ, thank you so much for agreeing to be the moderator of this session, and I leave now all the excellent conversation to come in your hands.
Thank you so much, Viviana. It is a pleasure to be here with such really knowledgeable speakers on this issue and coming from really different perspectives. So we have our first speaker today is Sheila Reger. She is speaking about Basic Income, a foundation for a healthier society and economy. Sheila is a founding member of the Basic Income Canada Network and chairperson since 2014. She's a former executive director of the National Council of Welfare. Her 29 years of federal public service spanned frontline work, policy analysis and development, international relations, and senior management. She has experience in areas of income security policy and taxation, with a focus on gender equality and race in particular. She is co-author with Chandra Pasma of Basic Income, Some Policy Options for Canada, which came out in 2019. So Sheila, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, AJ, very much. And it's a pleasure to be here. I too want to thank John Clarke and everybody who's been part of organizing this. It's going to be no surprise where I land on this issue, so I'm going to get right into it. Without taking too much time, I wanted to add just a little bit of context, though, about me, which sometimes explains where I'm coming from that looks like a mystery. So AJ talked a bit about my professional background. in my personal background, I am somebody who came to basic income, I think, like initially through the civil rights movement. So this is the era of Martin Luther King Jr. I am the white minority in my family. My children are Black. My son lives in the United States. He's about the same age as George Floyd when he was murdered. And much of the work that I did in the federal government was around gender equality. So race, class, and gender are kind of interwoven through everything I do. So I thought I'd start with a description, not a definition, but a description of basic income that BICN uses. People get confused about names and terminology, and they don't all mean the same thing. So our description of a basic income is that it's an unconditional cash transfer from government to individuals to ensure that they can meet basic needs, participate in society, and live with dignity regardless of work status. We can talk about it a little bit later. We don't quite fit the standard international definition of what a UBI is. So we can talk about that later if we want. But I think in Canada, we've taken a very pragmatic approach, and essentially basic income is income security done better and simpler than we do it now. It works in synergy with public services that we've already got, as well as cash allocations and services for things that are not basic. So I'm going to start going through a list of why, and then I'll get on to why now. So books have been written by lots of people on all of these things. So it really is just a list. If it feels sketchy, it really is in the interest of time. So the first reason I think there's so much interest in basic income is simply, I'll get to the why now later, but there's increased attention now to historical structures of race, class, and gender that essentially determine who gets income security and what kind. The second one that we often hear about is the rapid pace of technological change, and whether you believe one prediction or another about how this is going to unfold and what it's going to mean for the labor market, it is disruptive, and it's disruptive to individual lives. The disconnect between income and labor has been growing. We see an erosion of the middle class, and that is putting a lot of pressure on people who think they're middle class and think they have security until they discover they don't. We're also seeing, like, I think we limit ourselves if we look at basic income just from an economic perspective. There's so much in psychology, neuroscience, a lot of that research that's telling us that, I mean, when you look around, I see mass anxiety. I work with a number of teachers from like preschool to med school, and they're all seeing anxiety skyrocketing, just going through the roof amongst various members of the population. So we've been told that there's a way society works, and if you follow the rules generally, you'll be fine. And it's not true. It probably never was, but it certainly isn't true now. There's climate change. We've got increasing partners within the climate change movement because it involves a major transition, quite significant transition. And that's really hard to do if you've got people who are insecure and fearful and don't trust change. The last one on my list, and there's likely much more, but the last one is inequality and the threat of wealth. So I want to pause here to tell you a little story. A few years ago, because there was interest amongst the interfaith community in basic income, a friend and colleague of mine put together a workshop that was very much theological. So it brought in theological experts from various faith traditions and asked them to come and talk about basic income. So they went through historical texts and, all of these writings And obviously you're not going to find the words basic income in there. What was a bit of a surprise was there wasn't even that much reference to poverty. What there was a reference to, especially in the Christian Bible, was the problem of wealth. And it comes up everywhere. And I think we see now that, you know, there's a lot of talk about poverty. The problem really is wealth. And you know, these theological texts are full of cautions about not letting people get too wealthy. So I find that kind of an interesting dimension of this. So why now in particular is basic income exploding? And it really has for activists who have been involved in this over the past year. Things have gone from like 1 to 100 in a few seconds, it seems. So basically the year of COVID, I think, represents a magnification of all of these problems that we've seen before. And now it's even accelerating them. So it brought them to light. And now, because we haven't responded adequately, it's accelerating these problems that we've got. So, I mean, I don't need to go into things that we all know about how Black and Brown people are far more vulnerable to COVID. Women, you know, who have to care for their children regardless of anything else, shows us what priorities really matter in life. But essentially it shows us that our systems have failed us, that we need to do something better. So early in the second phenomenon that I think happened, and not just in Canada, but in the United States and worldwide, you see an emergence of cash. Cash is the currency of crisis. And so with CERB, with other emergency benefits, with the stimulus money in the United States, we see that cash works. Like, cash was the answer. Cash stopped a whole lot of bad things from happening. So I think that's why we're really focused on this now, and why the basic income debate is reinvigorated. So I've listed all of these problems, all of these reasons why people come to the basic income movement. There's this myth that explodes around this, though, that basic income is going to fix everything. And of course it's not. There's a quote by Andrew Coyne that was in the Globe and Mail a while ago that I just love. And he says, basic income doesn't need to cure the common cold. It simply needs to do better than what we're doing now. So for me, basic income, particularly at this point, it really can help reverse the slide backwards that we've been in for a number of decades. And as I said, cash is the currency of crisis. We've learned that with COVID, but it's also meaningful on an individual level when people feel crisis, and when people are involved in really complex lives. Cash matters. It gives you flexibility. You know, people face lots of complexity and crisis during COVID, but before COVID too. So I think the bottom line, and this is one of the areas in which we've been working with people in the environmental movement, is looking at basic income as having a transitional function. So it helps us transition out of COVID, transition out of these other problems, and moving to something better, where without it, it's going to make a lot of that virtually impossible. The next section that it was in my outline to talk about is principles. And I think this is where we start getting into clear definitions or descriptions of what we think basic income is. So our network includes a number of principles that describe the basic income we want. I won't go into detail in any of them, but it includes, you know, like eliminating poverty, promoting equality, ensuring that there's security all along the income spectrum. We need it to be progressive. We need to make sure it works in synergy with services and other things. So people can read about that, but it was a major move for the basic income, which was very ecumenical to start. And we gradually moved towards drawing a few lines in the sand. And our lines included, like, we're not into a Milton Friedman libertarian model of things. There are some very specific goals that we have for our basic income and principles that need to guide it. The next section I want to talk about, again, fairly briefly, is evidence. And there's a really interesting kind of debate going on in political circles now about what we know and what we don't know. There are people calling for more pilots. We think that's a terrible idea. We really do have an incredible amount of information from pilots around the world, from programs that have actually run in Canada that have basic income features. There have been so many studies and analyses of our different poverty problems, our racial justice problems. We've got reports on poverty. We've got the call for basic income for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. We don't need to keep reinventing the wheel. Our problems, I think, lie elsewhere. So I think the other thing is that from other disciplines, from health, from neuroscience, from other areas, we also have a good sense of what works and what doesn't work for people. And the kind of anti-basic income program that social assistance represents is one of those that really psychologically and physically can harm people. So, like, we know a lot about what basic income can do. What we can't predict is how it's going to roll out in a whole society that's changing in all sorts of other ways too. That unpredictability scares politicians, but that's what they get paid the big bucks for, is making tough decisions about helping ensure the future of our society. There's no perfect information, there's no convenient time. And in other cases where we decided we really do need to make major changes, like with the introduction of Medicare or seniors or kids benefits, none of that was easy. There was opposition, but those programs are in place now and very widely supported. So now I'm going to ask Hajar to see if she can find a slide that we've put together. So as I said, in Canada, we've been very pragmatically focused on what a basic income could look like here. As AJ mentioned in the introduction, we published, it was completed in 2019, but released early in 2020, just as we were discovering that COVID-19 existed and was a threat to us. So we developed 3 options for a basic income in Canada. And there are a couple of really distinguishing characteristics that I think are important about the report. First, it's a really useful read in terms of, understanding things that go into policy development. Another interesting fact is that one of our options actually is the universal demogrant model that you hear people talking about, where every single individual adult gets the same amount of money. And how would you actually structure that? And how would you pay for it? Which is a major contribution that the Basic Income Canada Network has made to understanding these issues, because very few people they're interested in what the benefit looks like. Very few people have put detailed work into how we pay for it and why we pick certain funding sources and not others. So this graph shows the results of our model number 1. Our benefit level is consistent across all of these models, so it's fairly easy to compare them. And the results are going to look fairly similar to this too. But this is one that a colleague of ours developed a graph out of the tables in the report. So if you can see what we've done here, we've taken funding within the tax transfer system that largely goes to wealthy people, money that's already in the system in little dribs and drabs, and we've put it together so that if you look at the bottom, the lower left corner here, you can see that the basic income at the very lowest levels, this is a life-altering change in income status and in security for them. You can see that the middle income brackets are largely unaffected, excuse me. And at the upper end, you start seeing how wealthier people pay a little bit more. So we modeled what we could. We can't model everything. And there are lots of ways, including, there are calls for wealth taxation. There are calls for other changes to the tax system. So the more you can find other sources, the more you can help ease the burden in the middle income groups. So this graph shows that the principles and the goals we started with are actually accomplished in this design. It is progressive, it's helping those at the lower end, it's not dinging the middle brackets, and it's ensuring that those who can pay a little bit more, but everybody gets security. Not everybody gets the same amount, not everybody gets the money all the time, but if the billionaire suddenly loses everything, he's going to be able to qualify for this benefit too. So this particular option number one, is also, it also represents a change in our BICN policy. Again, we were fairly ecumenical about which model to choose. When COVID hit, we changed our minds and we went, no, we have to do this fast. And this probably is the most feasible one because it reaches 18 to 64-year-olds and the other options involve more change. This one fills in the biggest gap that exists right now. The additional learning that we got from CERB, I think, also helps understand how this is feasible. Some of the things we discuss in the report are how a basic income needs to be fairly responsive to people's change in circumstances for this age group. And CERB has shown us that our federal government actually has considerable capacity that we didn't really know existed before, and that there's a lot of potential for us to design really good policy. So in conclusion, governments need to work to transition the kind of emergency cash benefits they've been distributing, understand where the flaws were in some of what they've done. We need to get better. No pilots, we're not going to learn anything useful from them that we don't know enough about already. And that kind of delay would just cause needless suffering. The federal government needs to lead on this. There are provinces that are interested in, particularly Prince Edward Island. They cannot do it on their own. It takes federal government, it takes national policy. And then with a basic income, many of the people now who are being dragged down by desperation and just getting by every day can actually start making greater contributions and planning, imagining how other social justice goals can be met as well. One very final word, and this comes because this is a global conference. This is my bringing in a little bit of international flavor from a meeting that we had just yesterday, I think. A phrase that is widely used in German in Austria that my colleague translated for us. And that I think almost everybody who was in the Ontario Basic Income pilot would attest to, because they talked about how life-changing being on a basic income was. The quote from my Austrian counterpart is, "The one who sees only money in a basic income sees only firewood in a Stradivarius." Thank you.
Sorry, thank you so much, Sheila. That was very interesting. Now I'm going to introduce John Clarke, who is speaking about basic income as a neoliberal trap. John spent 28 years working as an organizer with the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, or OCAP, and was involved in an ongoing effort to challenge austerity, poverty, and homelessness. He's presently the Packer Visitor Chair in Social Justice at York University. John?
Thank you so much, AJ. Well, I suppose the first thing I'd say is that that there's absolutely no disputing when Sheila says that there's been an upsurge of interest in basic income. In no way is that an exaggeration. I think clearly we are living in times that are incredibly hard and incredibly uncertain. And there's absolutely no doubt that people really want something better than the present situation. So I have to say that the striving that is going in the direction of basic income has to it a very positive side. It has to it the notion that that things can't go on the way they've been going on. And I am certainly not wanting to oppose that sentiment, but I nonetheless feel strongly that basic income is for progressive movements, for social movements, an enormous mistake. And to do justice to an explanation of why I think that's the case, it's necessary to look at some very basic considerations. So I think we can all agree that we live in a capitalist society. And within that capitalist society, there exists a job market. And that job market rests on economic coercion. That's always been the case ever since the peasants were cleared off the land in order to create the system under which we live. And so the role that income support systems have always played has been one that has been tied very much to that job market. You have a situation where at times of high unemployment, in situations where many people cannot participate in the job market, the alternative to providing nothing is a level of social dislocation and unrest that becomes threatening and highly problematic. So governments provide the reluctant concession of income support. The first model, of course, is the English Poor Laws. And built into that concept, built into that system, was the concept of less eligibility. The idea was that the provision of income support, the provision of relief, must be as low as possible, and that it must be delivered under circumstances that were calculatedly as unpleasant as possible. And so that basic function of an income support system has, I think, has existed down through the generations. That's what it's been based on. And in fact, that has been intensified greatly during the decades that we could describe as neoliberal decades. Coming out of the Chicago School of Economics in 1974, you see a paper published in which these right-wing economists tied to Milton Friedman are posing the question of why it is that unemployment levels have reached very high levels, and yet wages are not coming down. And the conclusion they come to is that the existence of unemployment insurance and welfare programs has made unemployment insufficiently terrifying. So it has been a high priority of that neoliberal period to reduce the adequacy of income support levels to the lowest possible level in order to create the climate of desperation that forces people into the low-wage, precarious job market. We know that in Ontario, as late as 1997, 1 worker in 40 was working for the minimum wage. By 2015, that had gone to 1 worker in 8. And it has been the gutting and the decimation and the reduction of income support systems that in large measure has enabled the creation of that low-wage, precarious workforce to take place. Now, in saying this, the point I'm trying to make is that this has been, for the system that we've confronted, and we haven't been strong enough to turn back, this has been a strategic priority. A system of income support that was insufficiently, I'll use the term in inverted commas, generous, would interfere with that flow of low-wage precarious work. So the first point that I would make about basic income is that I question whether it is in fact, in reality, whatever people would like to see and whatever people design on a drawing board, it wouldn't be exempt from the same kind of pressures to restrict income support as existing systems of income support. So I don't accept the argument that essentially and inherently basic income moves us in the direction of income adequacy. If it were implemented, the same politicians and the same corporate lobbies would be trying to ensure that it was as inadequate as it possibly could be. However, I would also suggest that in many ways, quite apart from the fact that it doesn't provide a kind of a magic bullet against the realities of the neoliberal period, I would argue that in fact, in a couple of very definite ways, a move in the direction of basic income would actually facilitate rather than impede the development of that regressive agenda. And I say that in a couple of key ways. The first thing is that you are looking about massively extending the range of cash benefits. You are looking to provide an income support system that in large measure constitutes a wage top-up. So what you're basically saying is that low wage precarious work is this reality that we just have to be reconciled to. And what we're going to do instead is, out of the tax revenues, we're going to provide a portion of the income for low wage workers. And I would suggest that that takes us in a very, very bad direction. It takes us in a direction where essentially we might want to believe that we can put in place some more progressive tax system. But what it's going to mean in practice is that somewhat better paid workers out of their tax revenues are going to be paying part of the wages of low income workers. And that really, I think, constitutes a de facto subsidy to employers that would in practice impede efforts to raise the minimum wage and generally raise low wages. And I also think that basic income very, very much represents in this neoliberal context, because the context is everything in so many ways, it represents an incredible extension of what I would call the commodification of social provision. There are indeed right-wing models of basic income. One of the most a clear cut of these is advanced by the right-wing political scientist in the US, Charles Murray, and he makes very clear that the basic income model that he puts forward must, first of all, provide an income that is low enough that it doesn't impede the flow of workers into the low-wage sector, but that it must also, rather than augment existing systems of social provision, it must replace them. And so in this context where we are dealing with an aggressive agenda of austerity and privatization, you are talking about extending the cash benefit, which I think creates the very real prospect that in practice, what's going to happen is that you're going to be told that you now have your cash payment and you shop through the privatized rubble of the social infrastructure. It would be something that, in my view, would facilitate the assault on public services and other social programs. Now, I fully acknowledge that Sheila and other progressive advocates of basic income are not engaged in some conspiratorial effort to further the agenda of Milton Friedman. But it is, I think, enormously telling that there are so many high-placed people in positions of on the ideological right, and who are themselves in their own rights very substantial capitalists, who enthusiastically promote the notion of basic income, from the Silicon Valley billionaires to Mark Zuckerberg, to Jeff Bezos, they all advocate for a basic income system. And I think they see the advantages of it taking forward the neoliberal agenda in precisely the ways that I've been suggesting. Milton Friedman, who was an ideological founding father, if you will, of the whole neoliberal period, was himself an enthusiastic advocate of a model of basic income that I would be the first to admit looks very, very different in many ways to what Sheila is putting forward. But I think the reasons why he moved in that direction are enormously telling. In his 1962 work, Capitalism and Freedom, he puts forward a very, very clear notion of what he means by freedom. And he means that essentially without a capitalist system, without a private enterprise system, no form of freedom no other form of freedom or no other aspect of freedom is realizable. And what he really argues is that it's going to be necessary to put in place a basic income system, because he reluctantly acknowledges that his system of free enterprise does have certain failings in that it produces things like extreme poverty. And he recognizes reluctantly that there is going to be a need to implement some form of income support. He makes very clear that he sees things like minimum wages and existing elements of the welfare state as being things that distort the market, as he puts it. But a basic income system he sees as being the kind of system of provision that would, while it would intrude to the minimum degree necessary. So that later than Friedman, in the presidential election in which Trump was running against Hillary Clinton, Trump's opposition from the right was a candidate for the Libertarian Party, Gary Johnson. And Johnson argued in his platform that if it were possible, he would eliminate all social provisions, all public services, all social programs completely. But given that that wasn't politically possible, he saw his meager notion of a basic income as the lesser evil. So I think that is the direction in this prevailing agenda that we are taken in by a system of basic income, progressive wishes and hopes to the contrary. I must just say as well that I don't think the measures that have been taken by governments during the pandemic period really do constitute a kind of an indication of where governments are going with income support. There is no question that in the context of an enforced lockdown because of a pandemic they didn't prepare for, with existing income support systems grossly inadequate, even the most right-wing governments were forced to take measures in order to preserve public health and social stability that they wouldn't previously have taken. But there is no immediate likelihood that an adequate ongoing payment of income support paid out on that kind of scale is something that governments are looking to do. Trudeau himself made that clear in an online event organized by the Financial Times that he took part in. So we have a situation where we do face this incredible crisis, and we have to ask ourselves, is the basic income approach, is the commodification of social provision the best way to go? For the tens of billions of dollars that it is proposed we could put into basic income, I would suggest that there are in fact much better things to fight for. If we were to extend the scale of social housing in this country, we would be making an incredible advance. If instead of looking for a wage top up for employers, we put the effort into organizing on the scale we need to organize to demand decent wages, to demand secure jobs, and actually not reconciled ourselves to, but actually challenge the low wage, precarious, reorganized workforce of the neoliberal era, we could be doing very much more. I will say finally that I think that basic income is presented as a progressive alternative. It's presented in some ways, even by some, as a radical alternative. In essence, I think it mistakenly reconciles itself to the essentials of a political and a social and an economic agenda that we should be fighting. I don't believe that in saying I reject basic income, I am for a moment proposing that there isn't a need to fashion demands and for social movements to engage in struggles on a scale we haven't done before. There's a real need to fight. There's a real need to organize. There's a real need to struggle. But I don't think the basic income offers a way forward. I think we can do much better than shopping in the neoliberal marketplace. I think we can fight to strengthen public services. I think we can fight for workers' rights and decent wages. And that, in my submission, is where we should be placing our priorities. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, John. So again, I want to invite people to ask questions by using the question and answer feature in the bottom beside the chat. And so I have a few questions for you both. So the first couple of questions are posed to you, John. And I'll be asking 3 questions and then hand it over to the 2 of you and then come back for another round. So a new question just came in. I'll get to that in the second round. So first question is posed to you, John, which I don't know that you can answer possibly at all, but so feel free to just pass or answer. So it's just from Dennis Reifield saying that he wrote a paper and in doing research for the paper on basic income was struck by the lack of critique of basic income from academics, and there's only limited non-academic labor writers and strong critique from yourself, Andrew Jackson, and some others, and is wondering if you can explain why this is the case. Another question coming in, it came in sort of 2 parts. So the first part is sort of pointing out your longstanding commitment to the complete eradication of poverty, and then asking why isn't it the time to move against the punitive welfare system and delink adequate income from participation in the labor market? And then I'll just ask my own question to the both of you. Sheila, I'm wondering if you believe that social assistance should be raised right now in the interim while basic income is being fought for. Why or why not? Especially because with the CERB, so many people on social assistance were really abandoned. And John, a lot of people who support basic income don't support a raise in social assistance. And can you sort of speak to your thoughts on this? So I'll turn it over to the 2 of you. And again, thanks so much for your talks thus far.
Okay. Well, perhaps I could, or do you want to go first on that, Sheila? Or?
Oops. The first couple of questions were for you, John, so go ahead.
Okay. Well, in terms of, I mean, I don't know that I could give a learned overview of all of the academic writings that have been done. I've tried to follow things as closely as I can, and I think it's fair comment. That that those who might play the role of left academic oppositionists on basic income have by and large not focused on the issue. I think there's been a fair measure of support within academia for basic income that's been advanced clearly. There's been a lot of writings on the question of basic income, but I I would say that I would agree with Dennis that I think there's a need for a much more serious attention to be paid to the question, because it has become, whether we like it or not, a major debate within progressive movements, and it's become, there is a real risk, which Sheila would celebrate and I would not celebrate, is there's a real risk that this could become for us our main generalized demand. This could become for us the thing that most movements are devoting a considerable amount of energy, and when they come together, the main thing that they're focusing on. So it becomes an important issue one way or the other, whether you're a proponent or an opponent of the idea. The second point is that the question is very polite and very proper, but sometimes there's this sort of an assumption made that if you're opposing the idea of basic income, you're doing so from the standpoint of really not caring that much about the adequacy of the income that people live on. I've actually spent a great part of my life actually fighting the existing system and trying to win substantial improvements. And I believe that fight is a very, very important part of what we need to do now. The fact that unemployment insurance, and I refuse to use that term EI, unemployment insurance has been reduced to basically a system that dumps people onto the provincial systems because it's so inadequate, is absolutely unconscionable. There's a real need to fight for really serious provision for disabled people as well. But my point is this: I don't accept the argument, the assumption that basic income inherently means we move in the direction of adequacy. I just don't accept that as an argument. I mean, some people will suggest because it's closer to being universal that it won't face the same kind of attack. But healthcare systems are a universal entitlement, or very close to being, and they face the austerity. They face the austerity pressure. If a basic income system were implemented tomorrow, and people were receiving an income that was actually impeding the flow of workers into the low-wage sector, there would be just as much corporate and political energy directed into trying to ensure that it was as inadequate as it possibly could be. So I don't sort of accept the premise on which that question is based. And finally, I don't speak for anyone. There are people who advocate basic income who will enthusiastically and fully support moves to improve existing income support programs right now. But I do think within the wide-ranging basic income movement, there has been a tendency to sort of take a lion will lie down with the lamb kind of approach. I did have a conversation with a bunch of advocates for basic income a number of years ago in what I shall circumspectly refer to as a southwestern Ontario community, who were calling for an increase were calling for a basic income system and calling on the then Liberal provincial government to put in place a pilot project, which did happen. And I suggested to them that it would take several years for that to happen, for anything could actually emerge. So would they, in the immediate period, call for an increase in social assistance rates? And they said they couldn't do that because the local Chamber of Commerce was part of their coalition and wouldn't support that. To which I said, well, if they don't support adequate social assistance rates, what makes you think they'll support adequate basic income? So I do think there is that tendency to sort of view basic income as a solution and not press for increases in social assistance rates and employment insurance. Not, as I say, by any means am I throwing that as an accusation at Sheila personally.
Okay. Yeah, it always strikes me, John, how much we agree with each other on so many other things, because you're quite right. I mean, everybody in the basic income movement that I know is also fighting for better public services and for workers' rights and that sort of thing. But I'm going to answer AJ's question directly, which was, whether I would support increases in social assistance now. And the answer is, well, yes, but I'm going to put on my other hat as former director of the National Council of Welfare, where for 40 years, there were reports produced on everything that happened within welfare systems across the country. And you see a clear pattern of nothing fundamentally ever changing. You'll get a friendly government that will increase things a little bit, and then they'll just go off and ignore it and let benefits erode due to inflation until there's another crisis. And then you'll find another government coming along and deciding that they need to have some money for something else in the province. So they start pulling back. I just don't think it's going to happen. And I think the same thing is true with a lot of the recommendations that came out of the recent British Columbia report. Again, their focus was to look at what the province of BC might be able to do. And I mean, there's just so many recommendations for new things, and that's added to this lovely chart they have that show that there are already 192 programs, I think, delivered by 20 different federal, provincial, maybe municipal as well, which would be the case in Ontario. So the structure of the system is wrong. It's horrible for people. The provinces, I would say, whether they really wanted to or not, they don't have the capacity to be able to provide a benefit that really is adequate enough to make much of a difference, which is why we've always argued that like basic income has to be a national program, and all of the designs that we've put forward use both federal and provincial resources. And they simply pull together a lot of things that are already there. And lots of them are already sorts of basic income. They're sorts of unconditional cash transfers, but they're all small. And they all pretend, or lots of them pretend, not to be unconditional. Manitoba's Rent Assist is a wonderful example. It's called the Rent Assist program. It gives you money. Nobody watches to see whether you're actually spending that money on your rent or anything else. Child benefits are the same way. They're called child benefits. They don't go to kids, they go to parents. And the adults decide how the money is spent, and they can spend it on anything that they want. And it works. So I think the bottom line for me is that like we have created a tiered kind of citizenry in this country where if you're privileged enough and lucky enough to be able to fall into the systems that sort of work, like the labor market, like unemployment insurance. I agree with John, ridiculous calling something employment insurance. So if you're already doing relatively well in the labor market, you're going to be doing relatively well with employment insurance that's based on unemployment insurance that's based on the labor market. Like we can't keep tying everything to a system that's become more and more fragile and incapable of delivering the kind of supports that people need. And so what you find, again, based on race, class, and gender dimensions in society, you can clearly identify the people who are going to be most vulnerable to falling into that category of people who are like second-class citizens when it comes to income security in this country, and they end up on provincial welfare rolls instead of part of the national systems that tend to provide income security for other people. And from somebody who spent years working in policy areas, looking at how on earth you manage to create some sort of a policy framework that recognizes non-market work, recognizes how much of that unremunerated and undervalued work in caring that rests largely with women, largely with Black and Brown women, like having these different strata in society is, I just don't see any future in that. I think we really need a national policy that makes sure that everybody is part of the same system.
So thank you so much. And again, I want to invite people to post questions to the question forum at the bottom, which is a forum for actual questions that we'll go through and give to the panelists. So there are questions to the panelists. So I have a few questions here. The first two are somewhat similar, so I'm going to try and combine them. The first one is for John, but I invite Sheila to also respond. I often hear you say that a basic income cash would just go to greedy landlords and the commodification of services. If this is true, why do you support workers fighting in unions to increase their wages? These wage gains go towards rent increases too. Also, your thoughts of basic income being a subsidy to low wage employers seems rather unfair to the precarious. We know Canada's universal health care subsidy is a subsidy to employers, but we don't fight against universal right to health care. I'm a union leader and I fight for basic income and better wages. And similarly, actually quite differently. So maybe we'll have time for 2 rounds. So the precarious gig economy depends on exploitation, but by securing a livable basic income, the leverage that these companies hold over struggling workers would essentially evaporate. We could, of course, still organize to unionize all of these employers, fight for paid sick days and so on. Why do these things have to be mutually exclusive? And then lastly, a question for Sheila, and obviously, John, you're welcome to respond as well. We have been fighting against austerity measures and privatization of social services for so many years. So this sort of comes back to what you were saying earlier, Sheila. And so this person says, I'm hesitant to think that UBI would not be dismantled also. I'm worried that politicians keep selling our welfare programs as an excuse to have money for the UBI, and then the UBI is canceled and we end up without services or UBI. I don't believe that politicians that don't even believe in a minimum wage will not try to attack the UBI. My question is, how can we guarantee that a UBI will not finish being a Trojan horse to dismantle our welfare system, and then the UBI is lowered to $400 a month or even canceled like Ford did? Those are the 3 questions, and hopefully we will have time for another round to get to more questions. So I invite more people to post questions if you have them, and those will be the last ones, so try and get them in quickly.
Okay. Well, then I could lead off if that's all right. I think, I think when it comes to, there's a sort of suggestion that that there's already a significant role for the cash economy, and that's unquestionably true. But what I'm suggesting is that our strategic priority should not be to try to, while of course there are income support systems that unquestionably need to be massively strengthened, that the extension of that commodification process is the wrong way to go. I'm suggesting that we can win more by actually challenging low wage precarious work and fighting for increased minimum wages than we can have a subsidy, a de facto subsidy provided to employers. Now, there is absolutely no question that if every government in this country had some sort of disorientating experience and decided that they were going to provide everybody with an absolutely living income on which they could participate or not participate in the job market as they saw fit, there's no question that that would make an enormous difference. But the point I think needs to be understood is that what is actually possible in terms of basic income faces exactly the same challenges and exactly the same problems and exactly the same opposition from the other side as anything else. And I simply don't believe that we can realistically imagine that we are on the cusp of a situation where the state is going to provide a de facto strike fund to people so that they can withdraw, or if they provide basic income, they will ensure that it is low enough that people are not exempt from economic coercion. It will be a system that will be subject to the same austerity pressures as any other system, but I believe it will take us in directions that are a mistake. I would also say that I agree with the comments about the problems with the austerity fight and basic income being subject to exactly the same problems. And I would also just as well interject that I utterly support the notion that in fighting for the social programs and the income support programs we need, the way in which the federal government has since the 1990s pulled out of the proceedings is absolutely outrageous. The elimination of the Canada Assistance Plan and all of the measures that were taken to reduce the federal role, the gutting of unemployment insurance, all of these things need to be challenged. So I'm not proposing a patchwork of provincial skirmishes. In many ways, this does need to be, our approach does need on many fronts to be federally focused. There's absolutely no question about that.
Okay, again, I'm going to agree with a lot of what John said. I don't think anybody's suggesting that a basic income is the answer to everything and that it doesn't face the same kind of problems and threats of austerity that are always going to be there. What's interesting to consider, though, is that none of those efforts need a basic income. I mean, they can destroy everything anyway. So using basic income as an excuse or a reason why they would then be able to cut back things is kind of a mystery to me. But I think the larger question is, as a society, as we look at where we're going now, and as we think about our own well-being in the kind of world of the future that we're facing, the biggest question is, why do we want so much of our well-being tied to employers? I mean, if the market and if employers are the problem, why do we want to attach so much to them? You see the differences in healthcare systems between Canada and the United States, where so many people aren't able to meet medical needs in the States because they don't have health insurance, because their health insurance is tied to their employer. So we all benefit from the fact that we have a health insurance, a universal healthcare system that doesn't depend on us having somebody who's willing to support that. It's for all of us. And I think income is the same thing. Income is the central social determinant of health upon which so much rests. It's so critical to our well-being, to our lives, the ability to have the autonomy to control our lives in that way. I don't know why we wouldn't want to see that disentangled from the need to be exploited in the labor market.
Thank you to you both for your very thoughtful responses. So there's just 2 questions left and we have a bit of time. So there might be another question that comes in, and if I'll let you answer these, and then if there's more questions, ask them. If not, invite you just to give some closing thoughts. So the first question is that some progressive economists have argued that eliminating the reserve workforce for low-wage workers on an adequate income support would be achieved by a job guarantee where the federal government provides decent work at livable wage levels and good working conditions in the care of environment sectors for those who want it, i.e. voluntary. so that private employers need to offer decent jobs when they need workers during strong economic conditions. Ends the low wage workforce for private sector. So this would end the low wage workforce for the private sector. What do you think about this approach? And then the second question, really quite related, is simply, isn't it time to abolish the wages system? So I'll just sort of repeat. The first question is about the reserve workforce for low wage workers, your thoughts on that in relation to basic income, and then the broader abolition of the wage system.
Okay. You want to go first this time, Sheila? Or?
Sure.
Hmm.
Okay, oops, let me just fix my screen here. Yeah, so my immediate answer to the question about job guarantee is no thanks. I don't want some government and some bureaucracy deciding what's a decent job for me. And I just can't see it working. I cannot see it working. The neat thing about money is that it's money. It's easy to come in, to send out. Our federal government does a really good job of that. It does a really bad job of administering services and things that need to be done closer to where people live. I can't see it. I used to work at employment and immigration. I used to work on the UI side, and I worked on the sort of the benefits side, and on the helping people find jobs side. It's a disaster. Yeah, I can't see the federal government making that work.
Okay, well, I'll say on a job guarantee, I of course utterly support the notion of investment for job creation, and I utterly agree with the notion of there being massively strengthened workers' rights. I do doubt whether a job guarantee is something that is. I've gone after basic income on the grounds that it's not conforming to the realities of the system in which we live. And I think perhaps I have to say the same thing about the concept of a job being guaranteed. In an economy that's driven by capitalism and its crises, I doubt that could, if it were adopted, could actually be a realistic possibility in my view. And the question is asked that I will certainly, far be it from me to shy away from, whether we should abolish the wages system. I absolutely think we should abolish the wages system. I absolutely believe we should expropriate the expropriators. I'm 100% behind that. I do feel that, unfortunately, that isn't an immediate possibility. I've spent a lot of my life railing against that harsh reality, but I think it is actually true that we are dealing with the present system for the foreseeable future, which isn't that foreseeable. And I think we do have to actually, at this point, think about the immediate steps that we must take, the immediate things we must be fighting for, the immediate campaigns we must take up, the immediate movements that we must build to press for these things. And so at the same time, I utterly agree that as we do those things, we should as well be posing a notion of a society that's very, very, very different to this one. So I didn't mean for a moment to be dismissive or to sneer at the idea of abolishing the wages system. I do feel we have to have a bit of a minimum program ready to go in the meantime. That's all I'm suggesting.
Thank you both. So we have a few minutes left, and I just want to invite you both to take about 5 minutes to make some closing comments, and I'll just ask Sheila if you would like to go first.
Thanks. I don't even need to take 5 minutes. I don't think we've had a really good discussion, and I think it's really important that we continue this kind of discussion. I do agree that it would be interesting to have a little bit more academic work, really focused on the opposition and done in a really serious way that looks at pragmatic proposals that are being made and not just theory. I think we've moved beyond that. I as a former federal public servant and somebody who was involved in the development of child benefits, which are a partial form of basic income, I know that we can do this, and I see it very pragmatically. I see the support that we've managed to get with universal programs like this. I see the need and the ability to do this being clearer for people now. I am not suggesting for a minute that it's easy. I'm not suggesting for a minute that we don't have to worry about the forces of darkness and austerity in this. But I think there's enough momentum and enough need right now that I think we can do a good job of this. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I suppose I too don't have that much to add, but I suppose what I'd say is this, is that, and it comes down to the basic proposition that emerged at the beginning, is that there is no question that we now, this is the final one of a series in which we've tried to grapple with the realities that have been created by the pandemic, and all of the crises that flow from and are related to the pandemic. And there is no question that in the period ahead, we are looking at an enormously challenging situation. The economic scarring that we're going to come out of the present crisis with is going to be enormous. The need to ensure that people are not abandoned is going to be an incredibly important one. We know from earlier discussions that there is a threat of eviction hanging over the heads of enormous numbers of people across North America, but in this very city. So the last thing I wanted to suggest is that we don't need to challenge the inequalities and the injustices and the racialized forms of oppression that exist in this society. We need to challenge them all. But what I am suggesting is that for all that, very honestly and very sincerely, basic income is viewed as a progressive option, in fact, it takes us further into the neoliberal marketplace. And I don't believe it's where we should put our priorities. There are indeed a real role for cash-based income support systems. And those things must be addressed, and they can no longer be and I've experienced this myself in the anti-poverty movement, the kind of the poor cousin of the movement where, those people on welfare, it's unfortunate, but not that much we can do about it. We need to vigorously fight for decent systems of unemployment insurance, for decent disability benefits. All of those things must be struggled for and very important. But when it comes to our focus in terms of strengthening the social infrastructure, I don't believe that the extension of the cash benefit is the way to go. I believe that what we must fight for is decent wages and improved public services. I grew up in the UK, and I'm old enough to have lived in a period when council housing over there, the form of social housing over there, was not something that was just simply for the poorest people. It was a main part of working class life. In the period after the Second World War, under enormous pressure, governments introduced wide-ranging, they provided social housing on a wide-ranging basis. If we were able to win ground there and extend massively the commitment to social housing, this wouldn't be a payment to landlords. This would be an actual taking back from the marketplace. So I think strategically, we must think in terms of how we challenge the grip of the marketplace, not how we make our peace with it. And on that basis, I reject the concept of basic income as a progressive option and repeat my initial proposition that it is, in fact, good intentions notwithstanding, a neoliberal trap.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you so much to Sheila, both of you, for your very important and unique perspectives on this really key issue that is very pressing right now, especially during this time of the pandemic. Thanks everyone for coming and joining us today. There will be a recording of this event if you want to check it out. It will be going up on YouTube in about 2 weeks or within the next 2 weeks, and the link will be sent out to everyone that's been registered. I hope everyone has a great day. Try and stay safe and healthy. Take care.